The knocking started at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday, sharp and insistent against my apartment door. I was making coffee and reading through some property management reports when the sound cut through the morning quiet like an alarm. 3 quick raps, pause, 3 more raps. The pattern my father had used since I was a child when he wanted immediate attention and compliance. I set down my mug and walked to the door, already knowing this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant. Through the peephole, I could see both my parents standing in the hallway, Dad's face flushed with righteous anger, Mom clutching a manila folder against her chest like armor. "Michael, open this door right now." Dad's voice carried through the wood with the authority he'd cultivated during 30 years as a high school principal. "We need to talk." I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door to find them both dressed like they were heading to a business meeting. Dad wore his best suit, the navy one he reserved for parent-teacher conferences and church board meetings. Mom had on the dress she wore to funerals and court appearances, complete with her pearl necklace and the stern expression that had terrified my childhood friends. "Good morning," I said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Coffee. We're not here for pleasantries." Dad strode into my living room like he owned the place, Mom following with her folder held at the ready. "This is about your living situation and the family's financial obligations." The formal tone set off warning bells. When my parents adopted business language, it usually meant they'd made decisions about my life without consulting me, then prepared arguments to justify why their choices were both inevitable and beneficial. "My living situation seems fine," I said, closing the door and following them into the living room. "Rent's paid, utilities are current, neighbors are quiet." "That's exactly the problem." Dad positioned himself in the center of the room, his principal's stance that was designed to project authority and control. "You've gotten too comfortable. At 31 years old, you should be working toward homeownership, building equity, planning for your future." Mom opened her folder and pulled out what appeared to be a real estate listing. "We found you a lovely 1-bedroom condo in Riverside Heights. The mortgage payment would be less than what you're paying in rent here, and you'd be building wealth instead of throwing money away." The condo listing looked professional, complete with color photos and detailed specifications. They'd clearly spent time researching options and preparing their presentation, which meant this conversation was the culmination of weeks of planning rather than a spontaneous intervention. "I like living here," I said simply. Liking something isn't the same as making smart financial choices. Dad's voice carried the patient condescension he'd perfected during decades of explaining obvious truths to resistant teenagers. "Your mother and I have watched you waste money on rent for 8 years. 8 years, Michael. Do you have any idea how much equity you could have built by now?" Mom consulted her folder like she was referencing official documentation. "We calculated that you've paid approximately $96,000 in rent since you moved out. That money could have gone toward building real wealth through property ownership." The numbers were specific enough to suggest they'd done serious research, probably including credit checks and mortgage pre-approval calculations. My parents approached major decisions with the thoroughness of people who'd spent their careers managing budgets and long-term planning. "The rental market in this area has also become unstable," Dad continued, walking around my living room like he was conducting an inspection. "Rent increases, gentrification, building conversions. You could be forced to move at any time, and then where would you be?" "Probably in another apartment," I said, refilling my coffee cup. "Would you like some breakfast?" "I have bagels." "Michael, you're not taking this seriously." Mom's voice carried the frustrated tone she'd used when I was 16 and she'd discovered I hadn't applied to any of the colleges they'd pre-selected for me. "We're trying to help you build a stable future." "I have a stable future. Living in someone else's building, subject to their decisions about rent increases and property maintenance?" Dad shook his head with the disappointed expression reserved for students who refuse to acknowledge their academic shortcomings. "That's not stability. That's dependency." He walked to the window and looked down at the street below, taking in the tree-lined sidewalks and well-maintained storefronts that made this neighborhood one of the most desirable in the city. "This area is nice enough, but you're paying premium prices for someone else's investment." He turned back toward me with the expression of someone delivering uncomfortable but necessary truths. "The building owner is getting wealthy from your rent payments while you build nothing for yourself." The irony in his statement was so profound that I had to suppress a smile. But I'd learned over the years that correcting my parents' assumptions usually led to longer arguments and more elaborate interventions. The condo we found has everything you need, Mom said, pulling out additional paperwork from her folder. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, updated kitchen, in-unit laundry, assigned parking space. And the HOA fee covers maintenance, landscaping, and building security. The condo listing was genuinely attractive, featuring modern appliances and granite countertops in a complex that probably appealed to young professionals who wanted the appearance of homeownership without the complications of actual property management. It's a 15-minute drive from here, Dad added. Close enough that you could maintain your current routines while building equity and establishing real roots in the community. Their research was thorough and their arguments were logical, based on conventional wisdom about real estate investment and wealth building that financial advisors had been dispensing for decades. I appreciate the research, but I'm not interested in moving. Not interested or afraid of the commitment? Dad's question carried the sharp edge he'd used when challenging students who made excuses for avoiding difficult assignments. Homeownership requires responsibility, Michael. Long-term thinking. Maybe that's what's really holding you back. The accusation of immaturity was familiar territory, part of a long-running family narrative about my reluctance to embrace adult responsibilities and conventional markers of success. Or maybe you've gotten too comfortable with the easy option, Mom added, her voice gentler but carrying the same underlying message. Renting feels simpler because you don't have to worry about maintenance or property taxes or market fluctuations. But simple isn't always better, Dad said, warming to his favorite theme about the relationship between comfort and personal growth. Sometimes you need to push yourself toward challenges that will pay off in the long run. I sat down on my couch and listened to them outline their vision of my future, complete with mortgage payments, property tax schedules, and home equity loans that could fund additional investments. They'd thought through every detail of a life they believed I should want but had never asked if I actually wanted. The seller is motivated, Mom continued, consulting her notes. They've already moved to Phoenix for a job relocation, so they're open to reasonable offers and flexible closing dates. We could co-sign the mortgage if your credit score needs improvement, Dad offered. Help you get approved for better interest rates until your financial situation stabilizes. The offer of financial assistance came with the unspoken understanding that it would also come with ongoing oversight and opinions about my spending habits, career choices, and lifestyle decisions. I don't need help with my credit score, I said. Everyone can use help with something. Dad's tone suggested he knew better than I did what assistance I might require. The important thing is taking action before you get stuck in a pattern of permanent renting. Mom pulled out what appeared to be a timeline, complete with deadlines for mortgage applications, home inspections, and closing procedures. If we move quickly, you could be in your new place by the end of next month. The assumption that I would obviously want to move quickly toward their chosen solution was typical of how my parents approached major decisions involving my life. They identified problems, researched solutions, and presented conclusions as if my agreement was a formality rather than a requirement. I'm not buying a condo, I said firmly. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to everything they'd spent weeks planning and preparing. Dad's expression shifted through disappointment, frustration, and the kind of principled anger he reserved for students who refused to accept guidance that was obviously in their best interests. Michael, sometimes you have to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. His voice carried the patient authority of someone explaining basic mathematics to a resistant child. We've done the research, run the numbers, identified the best available option. You can't just dismiss good advice because it requires change. I can dismiss advice I don't want. Want isn't the issue here. Mom's voice sharpened with the frustration of someone whose carefully prepared presentation was being rejected without proper consideration. Need is the issue. You need to start building wealth. You need to establish roots. You need to stop throwing away money on rent. What I need is for you to respect my choices about where I live. The conversation had reached the familiar inflection point where my parents' helpful suggestions transformed into demands backed by family authority and emotional pressure. Your choices haven't been particularly wise so far, Dad said, his principal's voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a judgment that couldn't be appealed. 8 years of rent payments with nothing to show for it except canceled checks and a lease agreement that could be terminated at any time. Which is why we're intervening now, Mom added, her folder still full of documentation supporting their position. Before you waste even more money on a lifestyle that builds nothing for your future. The word intervening was particularly telling, suggesting they viewed my housing situation as a crisis requiring family action rather than a personal choice deserving respect. I'm not wasting money. I'm paying for a place to live. You're paying for the privilege of making someone else wealthy, Dad corrected, walking around my apartment like he was cataloging evidence of poor decision-making. Every month, you hand over a substantial check to a landlord who uses your rent payments to build his own equity and investment portfolio. He paused at my bookshelf, scanning the titles like he was looking for clues about what had led to my obviously flawed thinking about real estate and wealth building. Do you even know who owns this building? He asked. Have you ever met the person who's getting rich from your monthly payments? The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to highlight my disconnection from the financial realities of my housing arrangement rather than gather actual information. As a matter of fact, I do know who owns this building. Some investment company probably, Mom said dismissively. Or a property management firm that owns dozens of buildings and treats tenants like numbers on a spreadsheet. Maybe a foreign investor who bought the property as a tax write-off, Dad added, his voice carrying the disdain he reserved for people who made money without what he considered honest work. Someone who doesn't care about the community or the tenants, just the monthly cash flow. Their assumptions about absentee landlords and corporate property ownership were probably accurate for many rental buildings in the area, based on news stories and financial articles about real estate investment trends. The point is, Dad continued, you're working to pay off someone else's mortgage instead of your own. You're building their wealth instead of yours. And after 8 years of this arrangement, you have nothing tangible to show for all those payments. Nothing except a place to live that I enjoy in a neighborhood I love. Enjoyment doesn't build wealth, Mom said, her tone suggesting that pursuing happiness through housing choices was a luxury that responsible adults couldn't afford. Security builds wealth. Ownership builds wealth. Equity builds wealth. She consulted her folder again, pulling out what appeared to be financial projections showing potential returns on real estate investment over various time horizons. If you'd bought property 8 years ago instead of renting, you'd have at least $40,000 in equity by now, she announced, pointing to calculations that looked professionally prepared. Maybe more, depending on market appreciation in your area. The numbers were probably accurate, based on historical real estate trends and typical mortgage amortization schedules. My parents had clearly invested significant time in building a compelling financial argument for homeownership. And in another 8 years, you'd own the property outright instead of still paying rent with nothing to show for it, Dad added. That's the difference between thinking strategically and just drifting through life without a plan. The accusation of drifting was particularly loaded, suggesting that my contentment with rental housing reflected a broader pattern of avoiding adult responsibilities and long-term commitment. I have a plan, I said quietly. Continuing to rent indefinitely isn't a plan. It's avoidance. Dad's voice carried the certainty of someone who'd spent decades counseling young people about the importance of setting goals and working systematically toward achievement. Which is why we're here, Mom said, her folder still full of documents supporting their intervention. To help you move from avoidance to action, from drifting to building something real. The conversation had evolved from helpful suggestion to family intervention, complete with research, documentation, and coordinated pressure designed to overcome my resistance to their chosen solution. The condo we found won't be available forever, Dad warned. Real estate moves quickly in desirable areas, especially properties that are priced reasonably for first-time buyers. If you wait much longer, you'll miss this opportunity and probably end up paying more for something less attractive, Mom added. The market doesn't reward hesitation. The urgency they were creating felt artificial, designed to prevent me from having time to develop counterarguments or find alternative solutions to problems I hadn't known I had until this morning. I understand you've done a lot of research, I said carefully. But I'm not interested in buying property right now. Not interested or not ready to accept adult responsibility? Dad's question was sharp with the kind of challenge he'd used to motivate underperforming students. Because there's a difference and it matters for how we move forward. The implication that refusing their advice indicated immaturity was familiar from years of family conversations where my choices were interpreted as character flaws rather than legitimate preferences. Maybe not ready, Mom said more gently, though her tone still carried disappointment. Which is understandable but not something you can avoid indefinitely. Homeownership is intimidating at first, Dad acknowledged. But like most worthwhile challenges, it becomes manageable once you commit to the process and start building expertise through experience. They were offering the kind of patient encouragement that had helped me learn to drive, apply to college, and navigate other transitions from dependency to independence. The problem was that I didn't need encouragement because I wasn't facing a challenge or avoiding a responsibility. I appreciate your concern, but I'm happy with my current situation. Happiness isn't enough, Dad said firmly. You need security. You need to be building something for your future instead of just enjoying the present. What if something happens to your income? Mom added, her voice carrying the worry that had motivated decades of careful financial planning. If you own property, you have equity you can borrow against. If you're renting, you have nothing. The scenarios they painted were legitimately concerning, based on economic uncertainties and personal experiences with financial setbacks that had shaped their conservative approach to money management. Or what if the building owner decides to sell or convert to condos, or raise rents beyond what you can afford? Dad continued, outlining risks that were probably realistic given current real estate market trends. You'd have to move on someone else's timeline, maybe to a neighborhood you can't afford or don't want to live in. As a renter, you have no control over your most basic need, Mom concluded. Housing security. That's not a sustainable way to live. Their arguments were logical and their concerns were reasonable, based on conventional wisdom about the advantages of homeownership over renting. The problem was that their entire analysis was built on assumptions about my situation that were fundamentally incorrect. Actually, I said, standing up and walking to my desk, I do have housing security. I pulled out a folder from my desk drawer, one that contained documents far more official and legally binding than anything in Mom's real estate research collection. What kind of security? Dad asked, his tone suggesting skepticism about whatever explanation I was about to offer. The kind that comes with owning the building. The statement landed with the impact of information that recontextualized everything that had happened over the past hour. My parents looked at me with expressions of confusion, as if I'd just claimed something that contradicted basic facts about reality. What do you mean, owning the building? Mom asked slowly. I opened my folder and pulled out the deed, property tax records, and mortgage documentation that established my legal ownership of the 4-story brownstone we were currently sitting in. I mean, I bought this building 3 years ago through Meridian Holdings LLC. I handed them the deed, watching their faces as they processed information that made their entire intervention irrelevant. I'm not paying rent to a landlord. I'm paying myself. Dad took the document with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning the legal language that clearly established my ownership of the property they'd been encouraging me to abandon. This is impossible, Mom whispered. You work at the nonprofit. Your salary isn't enough to buy a building like this. The nonprofit salary covers my living expenses, I explained. The building generates rental income from the other 3 units that more than covers the mortgage, taxes, and maintenance. The financial dynamics of my situation were apparently completely different from what they'd assumed during their weeks of research and planning. But you never said anything, Dad said, his voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose fundamental assumptions about my life had just been proven completely wrong. We thought you were struggling with rent payments, making poor financial choices. You thought what you wanted to think because it supported your narrative about my irresponsibility. Mom was studying the property tax records with the careful attention she'd once devoted to reviewing my report cards. Michael, this building is worth. This says it's assessed at $1.2 million. Market value is probably closer to $1.8 million now, I said matter-of-factly. Real estate appreciation has been strong in this neighborhood over the past few years. The numbers seem to hit them like physical blows, each figure contradicting months of assumptions about my financial situation and need for their guidance. Where did you get the money for a down payment? Dad asked, his principles training evident in the way he was trying to piece together facts that didn't match his existing understanding of my resources. I saved it from my previous job in finance, before I decided I wanted to do nonprofit work. I retrieved additional documents from my folder. The building was a foreclosure property that needed renovation work, so I got it below market value. You worked in finance? Mom's voice carried the same confusion she might have shown if I'd announced I'd once been a professional athlete or foreign diplomat. For 6 years, right after college. Investment banking, then private equity. I handed her my old business cards from Goldman Sachs and Blackstone, tangible proof of a career history they'd apparently never known about. I saved most of my salary and bonuses because I knew I wanted to transition to mission-driven work eventually. The business cards seemed to mesmerize her. Physical evidence of achievements and financial resources that had somehow remained invisible during years of family conversations about my career and financial situation. But you never mentioned, we had no idea. Dad's voice trailed off as he processed the scope of information he'd missed about his own son's professional history and current financial position. You never asked about my work history. You just assumed I'd always been struggling because I chose non-profit work over higher-paying careers. The assumption had probably seemed reasonable to them, based on stereotypes about non-profit salaries and their observations of my modest lifestyle choices. Michael, Mom said slowly, if you own this building, why do you live so simply? Why don't you have a car or expensive furniture or any of the things wealthy people usually buy? Because I don't need those things to be happy. And because keeping my expenses low maximizes the passive income from the building. The concept of choosing simplicity despite having resources seemed to be as foreign to them as the revelation of my property ownership. But people will think, your lifestyle suggests. Mom struggled to articulate concerns about social perceptions and status signaling that had apparently motivated decades of advice about my choices. People will think I'm content with what I have instead of constantly pursuing more expensive signals of success. Dad was still studying the property documents, his expression shifting between bewilderment and what looked like the beginning of anger. Why didn't you tell us? He asked finally. Why let us worry about your financial future if you're actually wealthy? Because every time I tried to explain that I was fine, you interpreted it as denial or immaturity. I gestured toward Mom's folder of condo listings and mortgage pre-approval letters. Like today when you arrived with a complete plan for reorganizing my life based on assumptions you never verified. The truth of this observation seemed to register, though not in ways that suggested they were ready to acknowledge the pattern. We were trying to help, Mom said defensively. We thought you were throwing away money on rent and avoiding the responsibilities of homeownership. You were trying to fix problems I didn't have based on information you never gathered. The conversation was interrupted by Dad's phone ringing. He looked at the caller ID with an expression that suggested whoever was calling wasn't someone he wanted to speak with at the moment. It's your Uncle Jerry, he told Mom. He's probably calling about the eviction notice. The words hung in the air like an admission of something they'd hoped to avoid discussing. What eviction notice? I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged the kind of look that passes between people who've been caught in something they'd hoped to keep secret. Well, Dad said slowly, we may have been a bit more proactive in our approach to helping you make this transition. Proactive how? Mom opened her folder and pulled out a document that looked official and threatening, complete with legal letterhead and language about tenant rights and eviction procedures. We had Jerry draft an eviction notice, she admitted. Just in case you were resistant to making the change voluntarily. I took the document and scanned its contents, noting the detailed legal language about lease violations, property sales, and mandatory vacating procedures. This says I have to vacate the premises within 24 hours due to building sale and lease termination. It's not real, Dad said quickly. Jerry just made it look official to add some urgency to your decision-making process. You created fake legal documents to force me out of my apartment? The question seemed to highlight the scope of their presumption in ways that made them both visibly uncomfortable. We thought a little pressure might help you overcome your hesitation about making a positive change, Mom explained, her voice carrying the defensive tone of someone justifying actions that sounded worse when spoken aloud. And if that didn't work, you were planning to do what exactly? Call the police, Dad admitted. Jerry said eviction enforcement requires law enforcement involvement, so we were prepared to take that step if necessary. The casual mention of involving police in their family intervention revealed a level of commitment to their plan that went far beyond helpful suggestion. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, Let's call them right now. Michael, that's not necessary, Mom said quickly. We can work this out as a family. You created fake legal documents and threatened police involvement. I think it's very necessary. I dialed 911 before they could object further, requesting officers to respond to a landlord-tenant dispute involving fraudulent eviction documents. What are you doing? Dad asked, his voice tight with the kind of panic he'd probably felt when students threatened to report his disciplinary methods to the school board. I'm letting you follow through on your plan to call the police. The 20 minutes we spent waiting for officers to arrive were among the most uncomfortable of our family history. Mom kept consulting her folder like it might contain solutions to problems she hadn't anticipated, while Dad paced around my living room with the restless energy of someone whose carefully planned intervention had spiraled beyond his control. When the officers arrived, they entered my apartment with the professional wariness that police bring to domestic disputes and family conflicts that have escalated beyond verbal disagreement. Someone called about a landlord-tenant issue? Officer Martinez asked, looking between the three of us with the practiced assessment of someone who'd responded to dozens of similar calls. Yes, I said, handing him my phone with the property deed displayed on the screen. These people are trying to evict me from my own building using fraudulent legal documents. Officer Martinez studied my phone screen, then looked at Dad with an expression that suggested he was reassessing the situation. Sir, you need to step away from the property owner immediately, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to defusing situations that could escalate into criminal charges. The transformation in the room's dynamics was immediate and profound. Dad, who had entered my apartment with the confidence of someone exercising legitimate authority, suddenly found himself being treated as a potential criminal by a police officer. There's been a misunderstanding, Dad said quickly. We're his parents. We were trying to help him make better housing decisions. By creating fake eviction documents? Officer Martinez's partner, Officer Chin, had taken the fraudulent notice from Mom's folder and was examining it with obvious skepticism. This document claims legal authority it doesn't possess. That's fraud. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously, Mom said, her voice small and defensive. We just wanted to add some urgency to encourage him to consider homeownership. Ma'am, creating false legal documents is a criminal offense regardless of your intentions, Officer Martinez explained. And attempting to use fraudulent paperwork to force someone from their home constitutes harassment and potentially criminal coercion. The legal terminology seemed to hit my parents with the force of consequences they'd never considered during their planning process. Are you pressing charges? Officer Chin asked me. I looked at my parents, who were standing in my living room with expressions of shock and dawning understanding about how far their helpful intervention had strayed from legal behavior. Not this time, I said. But I want them to understand that any future attempts to interfere with my housing situation will result in criminal charges and restraining orders. Understood, Officer Martinez said, though his tone suggested he thought I was being more generous than the situation warranted. Folks, you need to leave this property immediately and not return unless invited by the owner. But he's our son, Mom protested weakly. And he's an adult property owner who can make his own decisions about housing and visitors, Officer Chin replied. Family relationships don't give you the right to create fraudulent documents or threaten illegal evictions. My parents gathered their belongings with the careful movements of people who were still processing how dramatically their mourning had diverged from their planned family intervention. At the door, Dad turned back one final time. Michael, we really were trying to help. We thought you needed guidance about building wealth and planning for the future. What I needed was for you to ask about my actual situation instead of making assumptions based on limited information. We had no idea about your financial resources or property ownership, Mom added. You live so modestly, we thought you were struggling. Living modestly when you have resources is called financial discipline. It's what allows people to build wealth instead of just displaying it. The concept seemed to be genuinely foreign to them, contradicting decades of assumptions about the relationship between wealth and lifestyle choices. After they left, I sat in my living room drinking coffee and reviewing the property documents that had transformed their carefully planned intervention into a lesson about the dangers of making assumptions without gathering facts. The building around me was quiet except for the normal sounds of daily life from my tenants, people who paid me rent that covered my mortgage while allowing me to live exactly as I chose without anyone's permission or approval. Over the following weeks, I had several conversations with my parents about boundaries, assumptions, and the difference between offering advice and imposing solutions. They were embarrassed by their use of fraudulent documents and police threats, though they continued to struggle with understanding why someone with significant resources would choose to live simply. Eventually, we reached an understanding that allowed us to maintain a relationship while respecting my autonomy over housing and financial decisions. But it took months for them to stop suggesting ways I could better utilize my property investment or maximize my wealth-building potential. The condo they'd selected for me sold to another buyer within a week, probably to someone whose parents had successfully convinced them that homeownership was the key to adult respectability and financial security. My building continued to appreciate in value while generating steady rental income, providing exactly the kind of financial security my parents had been worried about, just achieved through methods they'd never considered or understood. Sometimes the best investment strategy is building wealth quietly while living simply, regardless of what other people assume about your financial situation or their opinions about how you should display success. The fraudulent eviction notice now hangs framed in my office as a reminder that good intentions combined with wrong assumptions can lead to remarkably bad decisions, and that sometimes the most important thing family members can do is ask questions before offering solutions.